The grand hall of unity stretched before them like a cathedral of stars. Crystalline columns rose 300 feet into the vaulted ceiling, each one pulsing with bioluminescent veins that shifted through colors no human eye had names for. Delegates from 400 worlds filled the tiered seating, their forms as varied as imagination allowed: the insectoid Vraask with their clicking mandibles, the gaseous luminar contained in elegant pressure suits, the reptilian Catharan draped in stolen jewels, and dozens more. The air itself seemed to hum with translation fields, converting thousands of languages into a seamless symphony of diplomatic discourse. At the center of it all, on a platform barely 20 feet across, stood the human Troupe of Terra Minor. Marcus Chen gripped his daughter's hand tighter than he meant to. Lily was only 7, her small fingers trembling in his calloused palm. On his other side, his son David, barely 10, tried to stand tall despite the way his knees shook beneath his patched performance pants. Behind them, Marcus's mother Eleanor adjusted the worn straps of her accordion, her weathered face betraying nothing of the fear Marcus knew she felt. The other 3 performers, Jamie, Cora, and old Thomas, stood in their positions, waiting for the signal that would never matter. They were the opening act, the joke, the brief human curiosity before the real entertainment began. "Papa," Lily whispered, her voice nearly lost in the vast space. "There are so many of them." "I know, little star," Marcus murmured back, forcing steadiness into his voice. "But we've practiced. We know our parts, just like we always do." A Vraask delegate in the front row leaned toward its companion, mandibles clicking in what the translation field rendered as laughter. "Humans. Always humans. Why does the Alliance insist on this charity display?" Its companion, a towering Gorath with 4 arms and stone-like skin, rumbled a response. "Protocol. They were granted provisional membership 60 years ago. The Council fears appearing discriminatory if they revoke performance privileges." "Discriminatory," the Vraask chittered, as if recognition of simple facts were discrimination. "Humans have no telepathy, no bioelectric fields, no phase shifting, no natural armor. They live barely a century. They require constant environmental controls. They are, by every measurable standard, the weakest species in the Alliance." The Gorath gestured dismissively with one of its 4 hands. "I heard their homeworld application for full membership was rejected again last quarter, 5th time in 20 years. The Council cited insufficient technological contribution and excessive resource consumption relative to galactic value added." "Resource consumption," the Vraask repeated with what might have been amusement. "A polite way of saying they breed too quickly for their station. 15 billion on Terra Prime alone, and they keep establishing colonies on marginal worlds. Terra Minor, Terra Nova, New Earth, as if naming rocks after their homeworld makes them worth settling." Marcus heard every word. The translation fields worked both ways. He felt Lily's hand squeeze his, felt David press closer to his side. His mother's fingers missed a note in her warm-up scales. But they had a contract, 300 credits, enough to feed them for 2 months back on Terra Minor, enough to pay for Lily's medication, the autoimmune disorder that made her joints swell and her fevers spike, the condition that human doctors on Terra Minor could barely treat and that no alien physician would bother learning about. Enough to keep them in their tiny apartment on the industrial levels, where humans clustered together, unwanted but tolerated, always 1 rent payment away from the streets. The performance coordinator, a bored-looking Zenthari with too many eyes stalked across its segmented body, waved a dismissive tentacle toward the stage. "Humans, you have 7 minutes. Begin when ready. Try not to embarrass yourselves more than necessary. The real performers need to prepare." Marcus felt rage flare in his chest, hot and futile. He swallowed it. He had swallowed worse. Yesterday, a Catharan merchant had spat at his feet while he begged for a performance slot. Last week, a transit officer had made Lily stand for 3 hours in a holding pen because her identity chip had a processing error. The week before that, their landlord had increased rent by 40% because, as he said, humans should be grateful for any roof at all. "Ready?" Marcus asked his family, his troop, his world. Elena nodded, her old hands positioning on the accordion keys. The instrument had belonged to her father, brought all the way from Earth 2 generations ago, when humanity still dreamed the stars would welcome them. Jamie and Cora took their marks for the acrobatic sequence. Their matching red costumes faded from too many washings. Thomas lifted his violin, the instrument nearly as old as he was, held together with polymer glue and desperate love. David moved to the percussion setup they had cobbled together from salvaged materials, discarded industrial drums, pieces of hull plating, anything that made sound when struck. Lily squeezed her father's hand once more, then stepped forward to begin the opening tableau. The music started soft, a human melody from Earth, from the time before the stars, when humanity still believed they were alone and special. Eleanor's accordion breathed life into the ancient tune, something called Clair de Lune, reimagined for their instruments. Thomas's violin wept over it like memory itself. David's drums provided a heartbeat, steady and certain, the rhythm of a species that refused to stop despite everything. Marcus watched his daughter begin the dance they had practiced 10,000 times in their cramped living space. She moved with the unconscious grace of childhood, her small body telling a story of hope and wonder, of a species reaching for the stars despite knowing how small they were. Her arms spread like wings, her movements painting invisible pictures in the air, a ship taking flight, a flower blooming, a child looking up at night and daring to dream. The audience barely noticed. Conversations continued in a dozen languages, the translation fields blending them into a dull roar. Delegates reviewed data pads, negotiating trade agreements and mining rights. A Catharan merchant loudly negotiated a contract for processed fusion cores, his voice drowning out Elena's accordion. The Vrask from before had turned its back entirely, more interested in the refreshment servitors floating past with delicacies from 100 worlds, foods humans couldn't afford, couldn't digest, couldn't even identify. But Marcus performed anyway. When his cue came, he joined Lily in the center, lifting her high for the aerial sequence, while Jamie and Cora tumbled around them, their bodies forming brief sculptures of human determination. They had no anti-grav harnesses like Luminar dancers, no phase shifting like Zenthari performers, no telepathic synchronization like Gorath ensembles. They had only their bodies, their practice, their desperate hope that someone might see them as more than the joke species. Marcus spun with Lily above his head, and for just a moment he pretended they were somewhere else. Somewhere the audience gasped in wonder, somewhere their art mattered, somewhere his children could grow up without learning to bow their heads and accept insults as the price of survival. Jamie completed a backflip, landing in perfect synchronization with Cora's cartwheel. Thomas's violin soared into a climax, and Elena's accordion thundered beneath it. David's drums built to a crescendo, his young face set with concentration. In the private boxes high above, a cluster of Azuri nobles barely glanced at the performance. One of them, his skin shifting from silver to a disdainful bronze, laughed at something his companion said. Another was fast asleep, his head tilted back, mouth open. A third was engaged in what appeared to be an intimate conversation with a Luminar delegate, their attention anywhere but the stage, except one. One Azuri sat forward in his seat, his multifaceted eyes fixed on the human troupe with an intensity that bordered on predatory. Lord Veyrath Cassisindri. Though Marcus didn't know his name, though Marcus couldn't see clearly through the distance and the glare of the stage lights. The Azuri's fingers drummed on the armrest of his seat, a gesture that among his people indicated calculation, consideration, the weighing of opportunities. His robes were worth more than Terra Miner's entire annual human quarter budget. His position in the Azuri ascendancy was high enough that even mentioning his family name required permission forms, and he was watching the human performers with the attention of a collector spotting something rare and valuable, or a hunter spotting prey. The 7 minutes felt like 7 hours and 7 seconds all at once. When the final note faded, when Lily completed her closing pose, arms spread, face upturned to the artificial stars in the ceiling, a picture of innocent wonder despite everything the galaxy had taught her to fear, the applause was perfunctory at best. A few species bothered with their equivalent of polite hand gestures. Most had already returned to their conversations, dismissing the humans as easily as one dismisses a passing thought. Adequate, the Zenthari coordinator said, his tone suggesting it had been anything but. Your payment will be transferred to your account within standard processing time. Exit through the service corridor. Immediately. The Luminar chorus needs the stage prepared. Thank you, Marcus said, hating how grateful he sounded, hating that he had to be grateful for scraps and condescension and the chance to humiliate himself for enough money to keep his daughter alive another month. As they gathered their meager props and instruments, as Lily leaned exhausted against his leg, and David carried his sister's performance bag, Marcus caught sight of that Azuri noble again, still watching, still calculating. Their eyes met across the vast space, across the gulf of species and status and power. Then the moment passed. The Azuri lifted a communicator to his lips, spoke briefly, and turned away. Marcus forgot about him in the desperate logistics of getting his exhausted family back to their transport before the next act began, before security decided the humans were lingering too long in spaces meant for their betters. None of them noticed the Catharan security contractors receiving new orders through their encrypted channels. None of them saw the service corridor cameras going offline, one by one, in a cascade of convenient technical failures. None of them knew that in 7 hours they would vanish so completely that even their names would be forgotten by everyone except a few human neighbors who would be told, politely and firmly, to stop asking questions. The Grand Hall of Unity continued its celebration, a monument to galactic cooperation and shared prosperity. Banners representing 400 worlds hung from the ceiling. The feast would continue for 3 days, celebrating another year of peace, another year of alliance strength, another year of prosperity for those who mattered. Somewhere in the service corridors, a human family counted their payment on a battered datapad and dreamed of the week of full meals it would buy, the medicine it would purchase, the rent it would cover. Elena hummed softly to herself, an old Earth song about better days. Thomas cleaned his violin with a soft cloth, his arthritic hands gentle on the ancient wood. Jamie and Cora laughed about a moment during the performance when Jamie nearly lost his balance. David held his little sister's hand, promising her ice cream from the human quarter vendor, who sometimes gave them discounts. Marcus carried Lily on his shoulders, her small arms wrapped around his forehead, her breathing already evening out towards sleep. "Papa," she murmured, "did they like us?" "They loved us, little star," Marcus lied, because what else could a father say? "Will we perform again?" "Whenever you want," he promised. The last image captured on the hall's security systems, before they mysteriously failed, showed them leaving through exit 47. Lily asleep on her father's shoulder, Elena humming, Thomas carefully carrying his violin case, Jamie and Cora arguing playfully about who had the better tumbling form, David trailing behind, his young face thoughtful. A family, a troupe, 7 humans who had committed no crime except being born into a galaxy that considered them disposable. Then they turned a corner into a section where, conveniently, the cameras had been experiencing technical difficulties all day, and the human troupe of Terra Minor walked into history's darkest margins, where the forgotten go to die, where the powerless disappear, where 7 lives could be erased as easily as deleting a file. But not all who are forgotten remain silent. Some leave messages in blood and stone and desperate hope. Some wait 6 years in darkness to be found. Some refuse, even in death, to let the galaxy look away from what it has done. The Grand Hall of Unity celebrated on, ignorant and indifferent, and in the shadows, something terrible had begun. 6 years later. Abandoned way station Gamma 7, Outer Rim territory. The smuggling tunnel smelled like rust and corpses. Vector pressed his secondary breathing apparatus tighter against his scaled face, his Catharan nostrils flaring against the stench. Behind him, his partner Jean muttered a prayer to the cold stars, her claws scraping against the corroded metal walls as they descended deeper into the station's forgotten sublevel. "This is insane," Jean hissed, her voice distorted through her breather mask. "The station's been dead for 8 years, abandoned after the Cascade failure. Why would the matriarch send us here?" "Because," Vector said, playing his wrist-mounted light across walls covered in frozen condensation and something that looked disturbingly organic. "Someone reported energy signatures 3 levels below the main deck. Someone's been using this place, and the matriarch wants to know who's cutting into her trade routes." Waystation Gamma 7 had been a minor refueling depot back when the Outer Rim colonies still pretended they could compete with the core worlds. Then the fusion core had failed catastrophically, killing 300 workers and rendering the entire structure legally condemned. Too expensive to repair, too remote to matter, it had been left to drift in the gravitational dead zone between 3 systems, a monument to corporate negligence and bureaucratic indifference. Perfect for smugglers, perfect for people who needed to move things or beings that the Alliance preferred not to see. Vector and Jean had been working the smuggling routes for 15 years. They'd seen every kind of contraband, weapons, drugs, stolen tech, prohibited biosamples. They'd transported refugees from contested zones, fugitives from justice, both legitimate and corrupt, and once, memorably, a Vraask noble who'd stolen his clan's genetic archives. But they'd never seen anything like this. The tunnel opened into a wider chamber, and Vektar's light swept across walls that made his blood run cold, despite his species' natural temperature regulation. Bloodstains, old ones oxidized to brown and black, spreading across the walls in patterns that suggested violence and desperation. Equipment lay scattered and broken, medical instruments, restraint systems, devices Vektar recognized from the darker corners of the trade networks. The kind of equipment used for processing, for breaking, for reducing sentient beings to commodities. "Oh, stars," Jean whispered. This was a processing center. Vektar's jaw clenched. He'd heard rumors, every smuggler had, whispers about black market operations that dealt in the one commodity the Alliance officially banned but unofficially tolerated: slaves. Not the legal indentured servitude that a dozen species practiced. Not the debt bondage that kept half the Outer Rim in perpetual poverty. Actual slavery, bodies sold, minds broken, lives erased, and the favorite targets were always the same. The species no one would miss. The ones without powerful advocates or military fleets. Humans. "Look at this," Jean said, her voice tight. She was crouched near what had once been a workstation, its screens long since dead, its data cores corrupted by time and cold. But next to it, partially hidden under a collapsed section of ceiling, was something that made Vektar's translator implant struggle with the sudden spike of his heart rate. A child's shoe, small, worn, designed for a human foot. With a bloodstain across the toe, Vektar felt something twist in his chest. He had 3 offspring back on the Catharan homeworld, and despite his species' reputation for ruthlessness, despite the casual cruelty that characterized Catharan culture, he understood the universal language of a parent's love. That shoe belonged to someone's child, someone who had loved them, someone who had put that shoe on their small foot and never imagined it would end here, in darkness and blood and forgotten horror. "We need to document this," he said quietly. "Every detail. The matriarch needs to know someone was running slaves through her territory." "Through her territory," Jean repeated. "You think she didn't know?" Vektar didn't answer. He didn't want to think about that possibility. The matriarch controlled 70% of the Outer Rim's grey market operations. She was brutal, yes, but she had rules. No younglings, no non-voluntary traffic, no operations that would draw Alliance enforcement attention, unless she'd been paid enough to look the other way. They moved deeper into the chamber, documenting everything with their wrist cameras. More bloodstains, restraint marks on the walls where chains had been bolted, a pile of clothing in the corner, human clothing, sized for adults and children both, some of it torn, all of it stained with substances Vektar didn't want to identify. And then Jean found the door. It was hidden behind a collapsed storage unit, nearly invisible in the shadows. But there was a faint energy signature coming from behind it, so faint that their scanners had almost missed it. Something was still powered on the other side, something that had been running for years on emergency backup systems. "Should we open it?" Jean asked. Vektar considered. They were smugglers, not heroes. They had no legal authority here, no backup, no reason to involve themselves in whatever nightmare lay behind that door. The smart move was to document what they'd found and report it to the matriarch. Let her decide what to do with it. But that shoe, that small, blood-stained shoe. "Open it," he said. Jean worked the manual override, her claws scraping against the ancient mechanism. The door groaned, resisted, then finally gave way with a hiss of equalizing pressure. The room beyond was small, barely 10 feet on each side. But it had been sealed, environmentally controlled, protected from the decay that had claimed the rest of the station. And inside, mounted on a salvaged data core that had somehow maintained power for 6 years, was a holographic recording system, still active, still waiting. Vektar's hand trembled as he activated the playback. The hologram flickered to life, grainy and corrupted in places, but unmistakable. A human man, his face gaunt with starvation and exhaustion, his clothing torn and bloody. Behind him, barely visible in the recording's poor quality, were others. An old human woman, 2 young children, huddled together. Other adults, their faces shadowed. The man spoke, and the translator rendered his words in Catharan. "My name is Marcus Chen, human, from Terra Minor. If anyone finds this, if anyone cares, we are the human Troupe. We performed at the Grand Alliance Feast in 3003. We were taken, sold, brought here. The hologram flickered, and when it stabilized, Marcus Chen's face was harder, older despite only hours or days having passed. They told us we would be transported to a labor colony, that we'd been purchased legally under some obscure provision in the Outer Rim commercial codes, that humans were classified as provisional sentience, which apparently means we can be owned if the right bribes are paid, and the right officials look the other way. Vector felt sick. He'd heard of that classification. It was a legal technicality that predated the modern alliance, a loophole that no one bothered to close because closing it would acknowledge that it was being used. Marcus continued, his voice cracking. They separated us at first, took the children. My Lily, my David. But my mother, his voice broke entirely. My mother fought them. She's 74 years old, and she nearly killed 2 of the guards before they beat her down. They threw us all together after that, called us troublesome inventory. The hologram corrupted again, pixels scattering. When it returned, Marcus was speaking faster, more desperately. We've been here 3 days, maybe 4. They're not feeding the children enough. Lily needs her medication, and they just laughed when I asked. Thomas died this morning. He was 81 years old. His heart gave out. They threw his body in the recycling chute like he was garbage. Vector's claws dug into his palms. There's something wrong with the station, Marcus said, and now his eyes were wild with hope and terror both. I heard the guards talking. The fusion core is failing. They're trying to evacuate their equipment, their valuable cargo. Us, they're just going to leave, lock us in and let the cold take us. Cheaper than disposal. Behind him, one of the children started crying. A small broken sound that Vector's translator didn't even try to render into Catharan. Some sounds transcended language. I found this recording system in the debris, Marcus said. I don't know if it works. I don't know if anyone will ever find it. But I need to say this. I need someone to know. We are not animals. We are not objects. We are human. And we matter. And even if the galaxy has decided we don't, even if we're too weak and too short-lived and too poor to deserve dignity, we are still people. My children are people. My mother is a person. Jamie and Cora and Thomas were people. The hologram flickered more violently now, corrupting in larger chunks. They're coming back. I can hear them sealing the doors. I hid this recorder behind the panel. I set it to broadcast on emergency frequencies. Maybe someone will find it. Maybe someone will care. Maybe... The hologram vanished mid-sentence, replaced by static and then darkness. Vector stood in the silence, his breathing harsh through his mask. Jean had turned away, her shoulders shaking. We need to search the rest of the station, Vector said finally. Why? Jean's voice was thick. You know what we'll find. We need to be sure. They searched for 3 hours. They found 7 bodies in the recycling system, frozen and partially decayed, but identifiable through DNA scanners as human, male and female, young and old, still wearing the torn remnants of performance costumes. They found restraint systems that had been used so roughly they'd scarred the walls. They found medical waste that confirmed at least one of the captives had died from untreated illness. They found children's drawings scratched into the walls with fingernails or debris, pictures of stars and homes and families that would never be seen again. And in the main holding chamber, sealed and frozen, they found 3 more bodies, huddled together against the cold. An elderly woman with her arms around 2 small children, protecting them even in death. All 3 had died from exposure and asphyxiation when the environmental systems failed. Elena Chen, age 74. Lily Chen, age 7. David Chen, age 10. The DNA database confirmed their identities, confirmed they were registered citizens of Terra Minor, confirmed they had been reported missing 6 years ago after performing at the Alliance Feast, confirmed that no investigation had ever been opened. Vector recorded everything, every body, every bloodstain, every piece of evidence. He downloaded the holographic recording to his personal drive and made 17 encrypted backup copies. And then he and Jean sat in their ship, in the docking bay of the dead station, and stared at the screens in silence. What do we do? Jean finally asked. Vector thought about his offspring, about the casual cruelty he'd witnessed and participated in throughout his career, about the 1,000 small ways the galaxy reminded humans that they were lesser, dispensable, unworthy of the rights that other species took for granted, about a father who had used his last free moments to record a message that might never be heard, just so someone, somewhere, might know his family had existed, had mattered, had been people. We send this to the Alliance Council, Vector said. They'll bury it. You know they will. Too embarrassing. Too many questions about who authorized the classification loopholes, who took the bribes, who looked the other way. Then we send it to the human territories. To every media outlet, every representative, every human with enough credits to afford a data connection. We'll be marked, Jean said quietly. Whistleblowers. Troublemakers. The matriarch won't protect us if we embarrass her clients. I know. Our careers are over. I know. Jean looked at him for a long moment. Then she pulled up her own wrist interface and began copying the files. My offspring deserve to live in a galaxy where this isn't allowed to happen, she said. Even if they're not human. Vector managed something that might have been a smile. The matriarch is going to have us spaced. Probably. They sent the files. Every recording, every image, every DNA profile. They sent it to the Alliance Council, to human representatives, to independent media networks, to activist groups that had been screaming about human rights for decades while being dismissed as emotional extremists. They sent it with a simple message. This is what happens in the shadows. This is what we allow. This is the price of looking away. And then they waited for the galaxy to answer. But before the galaxy could respond, before the scandal could erupt, before anyone could begin the process of justice or cover-up, one more transmission went out from Waystation Gamma 7, encoded, encrypted, sent on a private channel to a single recipient. Lord Veyrath Cassisindri, Azuri Ascendancy, received a notification on his personal communicator. He read it once, twice. His multifaceted eyes narrowed with something that might have been concern or might have been calculation. The humans had been found. 6 years of perfect silence, broken by 2 smugglers with inconvenient consciences. Veyrath considered his options carefully. Then he made a call to certain associates, to certain officials who owed him favors. To certain media networks he quietly controlled. The story would break. He couldn't stop that now, but perhaps he could shape it, control the narrative, ensure that the right questions were never asked, ensure that certain names, including his own, never surfaced in connection with the disappearance. After all, he was just an inspector now, just a low-ranking investigator who would be assigned to look into this tragic incident. Just a concerned official who wanted justice for these poor, forgotten humans. No one needed to know what he had been 6 years ago. No one needed to know what he had paid for, what he had authorized, what he had watched happen from his private box while humans performed for his amusement before being delivered to their true purpose. Lord Veyrath Cassisindri smiled his predator's smile and began preparing for the role of a lifetime, the righteous investigator, seeking truth for the powerless. But somewhere in the cold darkness of space, in a frozen chamber on an abandoned station, Marcus Chen's final message continued its automatic broadcast, still waiting, still hoping, still refusing to be forgotten, and the galaxy, whether it wanted to or not, was about to listen. Alliance Central Hub, Core Territories. 72 hours after discovery. The conference room was designed to intimidate. 12 stories above the diplomatic district, surrounded by transparent aluminum walls that offered a panoramic view of the Alliance capital world's gleaming towers, it served as the stage where careers were made and destroyed. Today it would serve as the battleground for something far more dangerous. Truth. Lord Veyrath Cassisindri stood before the emergency council session, wearing the plain grey uniform of an Alliance criminal investigator, 3rd class. The robes of his noble house remained locked in his private quarters. The sigils of his family's ancient bloodline stayed hidden beneath bureaucratic anonymity. To everyone in this room, he was simply Inspector Veyrath, a mid-level functionary assigned to investigate the incident at Waystation Gamma 7. No one knew he had spent the last 3 days barely sleeping, systematically destroying every piece of evidence that might connect him to what had happened 6 years ago. Inspector, Council Overseer Tharnix began, his Gorath features set in an expression of practiced concern. You've reviewed the materials provided by the Catharan smugglers. Please present your preliminary findings. Veyrath activated the holographic display, and the room filled with images that made even hardened diplomats flinch. The blood-stained walls, the small bodies frozen in their final embrace, the restraint systems, the refuse of systematic cruelty, and Marcus Chen's face, gaunt and desperate, delivering his testimony from beyond the grave. The evidence is conclusive, Veyrath said, his voice steady and professional. 7 human citizens of Terra Minor were abducted following their performance at the 3003 Alliance feast. They were transported to Way Station Gamma 7, where they were held in conditions consistent with prohibited trafficking operations. All 7 died as a result of exposure, malnutrition and deliberate abandonment when the station was evacuated during its core failure. The room remained silent. Veyrath continued, his multifaceted eyes scanning the faces of the council members. He could read them all. The Vrask delegates' mandibles clicked with irritation at the inconvenience. The Luminar representative's containment suit flickered with what might have been shame or might have been annoyance. The human representative, a woman named Administrator Chen, no relation to the victims as far as anyone knew, sat rigid with barely controlled fury. The holographic recording provides clear testimony, Veyrath said, allowing Marcus Chen's words to play again. The council members watched in silence as the human father described his family's fate, as he insisted on their humanity, as he begged for someone to care. When the recording ended, Council Overseer Tharnix cleared his throat. Tragic. Absolutely tragic. Inspector, do you have any leads on who was responsible for this operation? This was the moment. The moment Veyrath had been preparing for since receiving that encrypted warning 3 days ago. The moment where he would either secure his safety or condemn himself. The trail is old, Veyrath said carefully. 6 years provides ample time for evidence destruction and witness disappearance. However, I have identified several concerning factors that warrant deeper investigation. He pulled up a new set of files, and several council members shifted uncomfortably. First, the abduction occurred during the Alliance Feast, a high-security event, yet no alarms were triggered. No security protocols activated. The victims simply vanished from Exit 47 where, conveniently, the surveillance systems experienced technical failures for precisely the window needed. Technical failures happen, a Zenthari counselor interjected. Indeed, Veyrath agreed mildly. However, I pulled maintenance records. Those cameras had been scheduled for upgrades 3 months prior. The upgrades were delayed by administrative order. The order came from the Feast Security Coordinator's office. When I attempted to interview the coordinator, I discovered he retired to a private resort world 6 months after the feast. He purchased the property for 17 million credits. His official salary was 90,000 credits annually. The room's temperature seemed to drop. Administrator Chen leaned forward, her human eyes blazing. Someone paid him to create the blind spot. That would be my hypothesis, Veyrath said. Tharnix's forearms gestured dismissively. Corruption is unfortunate but not uncommon. Inspector, this suggests a crime of opportunity. Criminals taking advantage of a security lapse. Perhaps, Veyrath said, except for the second concerning factor. The human troupe was specifically contracted for the feast through an agency called Stellar Performers Unlimited. I investigated this agency. It exists solely on paper, no physical office, no other clients. No transaction history except the single contract with the feast organizers. It was created 2 months before the feast and dissolved 3 months after. A shell company, Administrator Chen said quietly. Designed to recruit specific humans for a specific purpose, Veyrath confirmed. The contract offered exactly 300 credits, just enough to be attractive to desperate performers, not enough to raise suspicions. The agency made contact with Marcus Chen through channels that appear, upon investigation, to have been monitoring human settlements for suitable targets. He pulled up more data, watching the council members' faces carefully. The third factor is perhaps most troubling. The way station where the victims were held and killed was owned by a subsidiary of RIM Holdings Corporation. RIM Holdings has extensive connections to outer territory trafficking networks. Their CEO was present at the Alliance Feast. In fact, he had a private box overlooking the performance stage. Several council members exchanged glances. They were beginning to understand that this wasn't a simple crime of opportunity. This was systematic, planned, connected to individuals and organizations with money, power, and alliance access. Tharnix's tone hardened. Inspector, you're suggesting this was a coordinated operation involving alliance officials and corporate interests. I'm suggesting the evidence points in that direction, Veyrath said carefully. I'm also noting that when I cross-referenced traffic logs for the week of the feast, 17 private vessels departed the capital world within 48 hours of the Troupe's disappearance. 5 of those vessels made stops at stations along the route to Way Station Gamma 7. All 5 belong to registered corporations with documented histories of outer rim operations. Which corporations? Administrator Chen demanded. Veyrath displayed the names. He watched satisfaction bloom on several faces as they recognized companies owned by political rivals or commercial competitors. Good. Let them smell blood. Let them be eager to prosecute so long as the investigation stayed focused on the right targets. The targets Veyrath had carefully selected to take the fall. "This is monstrous," the Luminar representative said, their voice filtering through their containment suit with what sounded like genuine distress. These were registered citizens, performers who had been granted temporary access to the capital, to prey upon them during an alliance celebration. "It reflects poorly on all of us," Tharnix agreed, though his tone suggested he was more concerned about the political embarrassment than the actual victims. "Inspector, I'm authorizing an expanded investigation. Full access to records, subpoena power. Report directly to this council. Find everyone involved and bring them to justice." Veyrath bowed slightly, the perfect image of a dedicated civil servant. "I will need resources, authorization to operate across Alliance territories, cooperation from local enforcement agencies." "Granted," Tharnix said immediately. "The Alliance cannot allow such crimes to stand. We will demonstrate that all sentient species, even humans, receive equal protection under Alliance law." Even humans. The casual qualifier hung in the air like poison. Administrator Chen's jaw clenched, but she said nothing. She'd been in Alliance politics long enough to know that open outrage would only diminish what little progress might be made. "There is one additional matter," Veyrath said quietly. "The Catharan smugglers who discovered the evidence. They've already distributed it widely through human networks. The story has gone viral in human territories. There are protests forming on Terra Prime, Terra Minor, and New Earth. Humans are demanding answers." "Demanding?" The Vraask delegate clicked irritably. "As if they have the right to demand anything. They are citizens," Administrator Chen said, her voice dangerously soft. "Provisional member species of the Alliance. They absolutely have the right to demand accountability when their people are murdered." "Provisional?" the Vraask repeated. "A status that could be revoked if they become too troublesome." The threat hung in the air. Veyrath watched Administrator Chen's face carefully, saw the calculation there. She was outnumbered in this council. Humans had been granted provisional membership 60 years ago, but they'd been denied full membership 5 times since. If they pushed too hard, if they made too much noise, the council could simply vote to revoke their membership entirely, cast humanity out of the Alliance, and leave them truly alone among the stars. It was the eternal bargain of the powerless. Accept scraps and indignity or lose even that. "The protests will subside," Administrator Chen said finally, her voice empty of the rage Veyrath knew she must feel. "Once they see that justice is being pursued. Once they see that the Alliance takes these crimes seriously." "Indeed," Tharnix said. "Inspector Veyrath will ensure a thorough investigation. We will find the perpetrators and make an example of them. The Alliance protects all its members." The meeting continued for another hour, but the important part was finished. Veyrath had successfully positioned himself as the righteous investigator while directing suspicion toward carefully selected targets. None of them would lead back to him. None of them would reveal that 6 years ago, Lord Veyrath Cassasindri had sat in his private box and watched 7 humans perform, then made a single call to associates who specialized in acquiring discreet merchandise for discerning clients. He hadn't wanted them for himself, of course. That would have been gauche. He'd simply facilitated the transaction as a favor to a business partner, provided access, made introductions, ensured the right officials were paid to look away, and received a substantial commission for his trouble. The humans had died because of a fusion core failure, an accident, really, that had nothing to do with him. If the station operators had been more competent, if they'd evacuated their cargo properly instead of just abandoning it, the humans might even have survived to serve out their purpose in some outer rim labor operation. Not his fault, not really. Except he couldn't stop seeing Marcus Chen's face on that recording. Couldn't stop hearing the man's desperate insistence that his family mattered. Couldn't stop thinking about those 2 small bodies huddled against their grandmother, all 3 frozen in a final embrace that spoke of love, stronger than any cold. Veyrath pushed the thoughts away. He had a role to play, an investigation to conduct, scapegoats to identify and deliver for prosecution, and a secret to protect at all costs. The meeting adjourned. As the council members filed out, Administrator Chen approached him. Up close, Veyrath could see she'd been crying recently, though she'd repaired her appearance before the meeting. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry now. Her spine was straight despite the weight she carried. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I know this investigation will be difficult. I know there are powerful interests who would prefer this story disappear." "I will follow the evidence wherever it leads," Veyrath said, the lie smooth and practiced. "I hope so," she said, "because those were my people who died in that station, and every human in the Alliance is watching to see if we actually matter to anyone but ourselves." She held his gaze for a long moment, and Veyrath felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. This human woman, representing a species the galaxy dismissed as weak and irrelevant, was staring at him with an intensity that suggested she saw straight through his performance. "Find them," she said softly. "Find everyone responsible. And if you discover any conspiracy, any cover-up, any involvement by Alliance officials, don't bury it. Don't protect them. Those children deserve better than political convenience." Then she walked away, leaving Veyrath alone with his carefully constructed lies and the growing suspicion that this investigation might not be as controllable as he'd hoped. Because the evidence was real, the crime was documented, and the more he dug into the networks that had facilitated the abduction, the more he realized how extensive the operation had been, how many people had been involved, how high the corruption reached, including, if he was being honest with himself, his own noble house. The Cassasindri family had interests in 17 corporations connected to Outer Rim operations. They held seats on boards that oversaw labor contracts and provisional sentient classifications. They benefited directly from the legal loopholes that made humans vulnerable to exploitation. If Veyrath pulled too hard on any thread of this investigation, it might unravel connections that would destroy far more than just himself. But if he didn't pull hard enough, Administrator Chen would notice. The human networks would notice. And the 2 Catharan smugglers who'd started this whole disaster were still out there, still watching, still capable of releasing more information if they felt justice wasn't being served. Veyrath stood alone in the empty conference room, staring out at the glittering capital of galactic civilization, and felt the trap closing around him. He'd been so clever, positioning himself as the investigator, taking control of the narrative, preparing his scapegoats. But he hadn't counted on one thing, actually having to look at the evidence, actually having to witness what had been done, actually having to see Marcus Chen's face as the man begged for his family to be remembered. Veyrath had spent his entire life learning to see humans as lesser, as commodities, as acceptable collateral in the pursuit of power and profit. Now, for the first time, he was being forced to see them as something else, as people, and he wasn't sure he could look away. Outside, the twin suns set over the capital, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in human territories, families watched broadcasts of the waystation discovery and wept for 7 strangers who had died alone and forgotten. And in the cold depths of space, Marcus Chen's message continued its eternal broadcast, waiting for someone, anyone, to care enough to actually seek justice instead of just performing it. The investigation had begun, but what it would uncover and who it would ultimately destroy remained to be seen. Inspector Veyrath gathered his files and prepared for the performance of his life, playing the hero while hiding the monster he'd been and praying that no one would notice the difference. Terra Minor, Human Settlement District. 2 weeks after discovery. The memorial grew organically, like something alive. It started with a single candle placed outside the apartment building where Marcus Chen's family had lived, then another, then flowers. Real ones, expensive ones, purchased with credits that families could barely afford. Then photographs printed on cheap substrate, images of the troupe performing at local festivals, at children's birthday parties, at community gatherings where humans came together to pretend they weren't alone among the stars. Within 3 days, the memorial stretched for 2 city blocks. Maya Rodriguez stood at its edge, her recording equipment humming softly as she documented everything. She was a journalist, one of the few human journalists who'd managed to build any kind of audience beyond the human settlements. Her documentary series, Voices from the Margins, had won awards that most of the galaxy ignored, but that humans watched with desperate hunger for representation. Now she was recording the largest story of her career, and she felt sick with the weight of it. "Tell me about Marcus," she said softly to the woman beside her. Yuki Tanaka had been the Chen family's neighbor for 8 years. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself, despite the warm afternoon, her eyes red from crying. "He was kind," she said. "That's the first thing you need to understand. In a galaxy that treated us like garbage, Marcus Chen was kind. Maya's camera captured Yuki's face, the exhaustion and grief etched into features too young to carry such weight. "Tell me a story," Maya prompted gently. Yuki smiled, though tears streamed down her face. There was a family down the hall, the Okonkwo's. Their son was sick, really sick, and they couldn't afford the treatment. Human medical care is expensive here because no alien doctors will see us, and human doctors have to import everything from Earth. Marcus found out and organized a benefit performance. Free concert in the plaza. He got every human artist in the district to participate. They raised enough for 3 months of treatment. Did the boy survive? He did. He's 12 now. He left flowers at the memorial yesterday. Yuki's voice broke. Marcus never asked for anything in return. Never made a show of it. That's just who he was. Maya interviewed 17 neighbors that day. Each one had a story. Marcus helping with rent when someone lost their job. Eleanor teaching children to read and write in 3 languages. Lily and David playing in the corridors, bringing joy to a place that had so little of it. The Chen family had been ordinary people, poor, struggling, dismissed by the galaxy as insignificant, and they had mattered deeply to the community they'd been stolen from. That evening, Maya attended a protest gathering in Terra Minor's central plaza. Thousands of humans had assembled, carrying signs and chanting slogans that would have gotten them arrested on any core world. Here, on the fringes of Alliance space, they could speak freely because no one important enough to silence them was listening. "We are not commodities," the crowd roared. "We are not disposable." Maya recorded it all, her equipment capturing the faces of people who'd never had power but were discovering their voices anyway. A mechanic who'd worked triple shifts to send his daughter to engineering school. A grandmother who'd survived the evacuation of Earth's Australian continent when the climate finally collapsed. A young boy holding a sign that read, "Lily and David were my friends." The speakers were powerful. Administrator Chen had come from the capital, her presence lending official weight to the gathering. She stood on the makeshift stage, her voice amplified across the plaza, and spoke with a fury that had been carefully contained in the council chambers. "They want us to be quiet," she said. "They want us to accept that 7 of our people can be murdered and forgotten because we don't have warships, because we don't have telepathy or phase shifting or bioelectric fields, because we're weak." The crowd roared denial. "But I say we are not weak. We are resilient. We survive in a galaxy that doesn't want us. We build communities in places no other species would tolerate. We raise our children with hope despite everything the universe does to crush it, and we will not be silent about this atrocity." Maya felt something shift in the crowd's energy. This wasn't just grief anymore. It was rage. It was determination. It was the collective awakening of a species that had spent 60 years accepting scraps and indignity because they had no other choice. Now they were choosing differently. After the rally, Maya interviewed Administrator Chen privately, in a small office borrowed from the local human representative. The administrator looked exhausted, her professional composure cracking around the edges. "Do you believe the investigation will actually deliver justice?" Maya asked. Administrator Chen was quiet for a long moment. "I believe Inspector Veyrath will find someone to prosecute. I'm less certain he'll find everyone responsible." "You think there's a cover-up?" "I think there are powerful interests who would prefer certain questions never get asked. I think the inspector is a skilled political operator who knows how to satisfy public outrage without actually threatening the systems that allowed this to happen." Maya leaned forward. "Then why not say that publicly? Why not expose it?" "Because," Administrator Chen said tiredly, "I am one voice on a council of 47. Humans represent 3% of Alliance population and control less than 1% of Alliance resources. If I push too hard, if I make too much noise, they can revoke our membership entirely, and then we have nothing. No representation, no legal protections, however inadequate, no hope of ever being treated as equals. So we accept justice theater instead of real accountability. We accept what we can get and keep pushing for more. It's not heroic, it's not satisfying, but it's survival." Administrator Chen met Maya's eyes. "Do you know why I came to this rally, why I'm risking my position by speaking so openly?" Maya shook her head. "Because those people out there need to know someone is fighting for them. They need to see that their government, weak as it is, hasn't abandoned them. And because the alternative, accepting that 7 humans can be murdered without consequence, is worse than any political risk I might face." Maya published her documentary 3 days later. It went viral through human networks, then jumped species barriers as sympathetic aliens began sharing it. The Luminar delegate to the Alliance Council sent it to every member of her government. The Catharan smugglers who'd discovered the way station appeared in interviews describing what they'd found with a bluntness that made even hardened viewers flinch. And everywhere, across hundreds of worlds, people began asking uncomfortable questions. How many other humans had disappeared? How many other species had been trafficked using the same legal loopholes? Who benefited from keeping provisional species in a permanent state of vulnerability? Veyrath watched the documentary from his office, alone in the dark, and felt the investigation spiraling beyond his control. Maya Rodriguez was a better journalist than he'd anticipated. She'd found witnesses he'd hoped to ignore. She'd uncovered connections he'd tried to bury. Worse, she'd made the victims human in a way that simple facts couldn't. Marcus Chen wasn't just a name in a file anymore. He was a kind neighbor, a struggling father, a man who'd organized benefit concerts and helped pay strangers' rent. Lily Chen wasn't just a casualty statistic. She was a 7-year-old girl who'd needed medication her family could barely afford, who'd played in corridors with other children, who'd drawn pictures of stars and dreamed of better days. Elena Chen wasn't just an elderly victim. She'd been a teacher, a grandmother, a woman who'd fought armed guards to protect her grandchildren even though she'd known she couldn't win. Veyrath had spent 2 weeks interviewing suspects, following leads, building his case against the carefully selected scapegoats, but every night he watched Maya's documentary again, listened to neighbors describe the family he'd helped destroy, saw footage of the memorial that stretched for blocks, and slowly, inexorably, something inside him began to crack. He told himself it had been business, a transaction, that humans were provisional sentience, barely above livestock in practical terms, and their classification made them fair game for certain commercial arrangements. But watching Yuki Tanaka describe Marcus organizing a benefit concert, watching a 12-year-old boy leave flowers for the man who'd saved his life, watching thousands of humans gather to declare that they mattered, Veyrath couldn't maintain the comfortable fiction anymore. He had helped murder people, not commodities, not provisional sentience, not acceptable collateral, people. The realization sat in his chest like ice. Veyrath pulled up his investigation files again. The real ones. Not the sanitized version he was preparing for the council. He'd been planning to deliver 3 mid-level traffickers and a corrupt security coordinator. Enough to satisfy public outcry, enough to demonstrate alliance justice, not enough to threaten the actual networks that had facilitated the operation, not enough to expose the noble houses and corporations that profited from the systematic exploitation of weaker species, not enough to expose himself. He stared at the files for 3 hours. At the evidence he'd collected and the evidence he'd buried, at the web of connections that led back to his own family, his own house, his own bank accounts, at Marcus Chen's face on that holographic recording, begging for someone to care. Veyrath had 3 choices. He could proceed with his plan, deliver his scapegoats, and let the investigation die a quiet death. He could resign and disappear into obscurity, leaving the case unresolved. Or he could do something that would almost certainly destroy him. He could tell the truth, all of it, including his own complicity. The smart choice was obvious. Self-preservation, protection of his house, maintenance of the systems that had served his species so well for so long. But Veyrath kept hearing Administrator Chen's words. Those children deserve better than political convenience. He kept seeing those small bodies huddled against their grandmother. He kept remembering that he had offspring of his own, that he loved them with a fierceness that transcended species, and that if someone had done to his children what had been done to Lily and David Chen, he would have burned the galaxy to ash for revenge. At 3 in the morning, Veyrath made his decision. He began compiling a new report. This one included everything, every connection, every noble house involved, every corporation that had profited, every official who'd taken bribes, every legal loophole that had been deliberately maintained to facilitate trafficking, and his own role in the Chen family's abduction and death. He worked through the night, assembling a document that would probably end his life, but might, possibly, change something. He encrypted it 17 different ways and sent copies to Maya Rodriguez, to Administrator Chen, to the Catharan smugglers, to independent media networks across Alliance space. Then he sent one final copy to the Alliance Council, scheduled to be delivered in 48 hours. By then, he would be either arrested or dead. His house would be disgraced. His name would become synonymous with the very crimes he'd helped perpetrate. But perhaps, just perhaps, 7 humans would finally receive the justice they'd been denied. Veyrath sat in his dark office and thought about his offspring, about how he would explain this to them someday, if he survived, about whether they would understand that their father had been a monster who'd tried too late to become something better. Outside, the twin suns rose over the capital, painting the sky in shades of gold that reminded him of human hope. And somewhere in the vast network of human settlements, Maya Rodriguez received an encrypted file from an unexpected source and began to read with increasing disbelief. The investigation was about to break wide open, and nothing would ever be the same. Alliance Central Hub. 48 hours after Veyrath's decision. The emergency council session had been called with only 6 hours' notice. Council members arrived confused and irritated, expecting another tedious procedural matter or minor diplomatic crisis. They filed into the grand chamber, taking their designated seats, murmuring complaints about disrupted schedules and insufficient briefing materials. None of them knew that in 18 minutes their galaxy would fracture. Maya Rodriguez sat in the press gallery, her recording equipment active, her heart hammering against her ribs. The encrypted file from Inspector Veyrath had arrived 2 days ago. She'd spent 48 hours verifying its contents, cross-referencing names and transactions, confirming what seemed impossible. An Ajuri noble confessing to facilitating the murder of 7 humans. Not just any noble, an inspector assigned to investigate the very crime he'd helped commit. It was career suicide, political annihilation, possibly literal death if the right or wrong people decided he knew too much. And yet, he'd done it, compiled every piece of evidence, named every name, traced every payment, including payments to himself. Maya had contacted Administrator Chen immediately. Together, they decided on the only strategy that might work: public revelation before anyone could suppress the information, force it into the open where burying it would be impossible. So here they were. Council members settling into their seats, security officers positioned at every exit, media representatives from 300 worlds waiting to broadcast whatever mundane proceeding was about to unfold. No one, except Maya, Administrator Chen, and Veyrath himself knew that the galaxy was about to watch a man commit political suicide in real time. Council Overseer Tharnix called the session to order. "We're here at the request of Inspector Veyrath, who has indicated he has urgent information regarding the Way Station Gamma 7 investigation. Inspector, you have the floor." Veyrath stood from his position at the investigator's podium. He wore his grey uniform, plain and unremarkable. His multifaceted eyes scanned the chamber, pausing briefly on Maya in the press gallery, then on Administrator Chen in the council seating. Then he began. "Council members, honored delegates, citizens of the Alliance." His voice carried clearly through the chamber's amplification system. "I stand before you today not as Inspector Veyrath, but as Lord Veyrath Cassasindri of the Ajuri Ascendancy. And I stand here to confess to crimes that shame not only myself, but the very institutions we claim to hold sacred." The chamber erupted in confused murmurs. Tharnix's 4 arms gestured for silence. "Inspector, what are you—" "6 years ago," Veyrath continued, his voice cutting through the noise, "I attended the Grand Alliance feast. I occupied a private box overlooking the performance stage. From that position, I watched 7 humans perform. A family, parents, children, grandmother, struggling performers who'd been recruited through a shell company I helped establish." The murmuring stopped. The chamber fell into shocked silence. "I watched them perform, and then I made a call to business associates who specialized in acquiring discrete merchandise, humans specifically, provisional sentients whose legal classification made them vulnerable to exploitation. I facilitated their abduction. I arranged for security systems to fail at the precise moment they would pass through exit 47. I received a commission of 85,000 credits for the transaction." Maya's camera captured every face in the chamber. The disbelief, the dawning horror. The Vraask delegate whose mandibles had frozen mid-click. The Luminar representative whose containment suit flickered with shock. Administrator Chen, whose expression was carefully neutral despite the vindication and grief that must be tearing through her. "The humans were transported to Way Station Gamma 7, Veyrath said. "They were held in conditions I now understand constitute torture. They were starved, restrained, separated from their children. They were told they would be sold to labor operations in the Outer Rim. They were classified as provisional sentients, which under Alliance commercial codes means they could be owned if the proper fees were paid and the proper officials bribed. He pulled up holographic displays flooding the chamber with evidence: financial transactions, communication logs, names of officials and corporate executives, a web of corruption so extensive that several council members audibly gasped. Marcus Chen, age 37, electrical engineer who became a performer when the factory he worked for closed, father, widower, neighbor, who helped others pay their rent. Images appeared: Marcus's identification photo, pictures from the memorial on Terra Minor, testimonials from neighbors describing his kindness. Eleanor Chen, age 74, teacher, grandmother, survivor of Earth's climate crisis. She fought the guards who tried to separate her from her grandchildren. They beat her unconscious. More images: Elena teaching children in a crowded apartment, Elena playing accordion at a community festival, Elena's body frozen in the way station, arms still wrapped protectively around small forms. Lily Chen, age 7. She had an autoimmune disorder. She needed medication her family could barely afford. She died of exposure and asphyxiation when the way station's environmental systems failed during evacuation. Lily's school picture appeared: a gap-toothed smile, eyes full of innocent hope. The chamber was absolutely silent now. Several delegates had turned away from the images. David Chen, age 10. He wanted to be a musician. He practiced percussion on salvaged materials because his family couldn't afford real instruments. He died holding his sister's hand. David's face: young, earnest, full of dreams that would never be realized. Veyrath continued through all 7 names, all 7 stories, making the council see them as people instead of statistics. Jamie Torres, Cora Ose, Thomas Way, each one with histories, with families, with communities that mourned them. When the way station's fusion core began failing, Veyrath said, his voice thick with something that might have been emotion, the traffickers evacuated their valuable cargo, the expensive merchandise, the items that mattered. They left the humans locked in a holding chamber, because disposing of them properly would have cost time and credits they didn't want to spend. The holographic display showed the chamber where the bodies had been found, the frozen tableau of Elena sheltering her grandchildren, the scratched drawings on the walls, the small shoe that had haunted Vectar the smuggler. Marcus Chen used his final free moments to record a message, Veyrath said. He hid the recording system where his captors wouldn't find it. He set it to broadcast on emergency frequencies, and he begged for someone to remember that his family had been people, that they had mattered. He played the recording again. Marcus's gaunt face, his desperate voice, his insistence on humanity's worth despite everything the galaxy had done to deny it. When the recording ended, Veyrath stood in the silence and delivered the words that would end his life as he knew it. I am responsible for their deaths. Not solely. There are dozens of others involved, and I have compiled complete evidence against all of them. But I facilitated the abduction that led to their deaths. I profited from their suffering. And when I was assigned to investigate this crime, I planned to deliver scapegoats while protecting the actual networks responsible. Protecting myself, Tharnix found his voice, though it trembled with barely controlled fury. Why are you confessing this? Why now? Because, Veyrath said quietly, I have offspring. I love them the way Marcus Chen loved his children, and I realized that if someone had done to my offspring what I helped do to his, I would want someone, anyone, to care enough to seek real justice instead of political theater. He pulled up the final set of evidence, the names that made half the council flinch: noble houses, major corporations, officials in the Alliance bureaucracy. Some of them were sitting in this very chamber. This investigation revealed a systematic operation spanning decades, thousands of humans and other provisional sentients trafficked using legal loopholes that this council has repeatedly refused to close. Loopholes maintained deliberately because they benefit powerful interests, because they generate profits, because no one with actual power cared enough about the victims to stop it. Administrator Chen stood, her voice carried across the chamber, with a strength that belied her species' reputation for weakness. The inspector has provided me with complete evidence files. I am distributing them to all media networks immediately. Every name, every transaction, every official who took bribes, every noble house that profited, everything. Chaos erupted, council members shouting, security officers uncertain whether they should be arresting Veyrath or protecting him. Media representatives frantically transmitting the breaking story across Alliance space. Maya recorded it all, her hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. This was the moment everything changed. This was the moment the galaxy could no longer look away. Tharnik slammed his hands on the podium, demanding order. Inspector Veyrath, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit trafficking, murder, and corruption. Security, take him into custody. I expected nothing less, Veyrath said calmly. As security officers approached, he looked directly at the cameras, at the media representatives, at the galaxy watching. I am guilty of monstrous crimes. I deserve punishment, but I am not alone in my guilt. And if my confession helps dismantle the systems that made these crimes possible, then perhaps the Chen family did not die for nothing. The security officers secured restraints around Veyrath's wrists. As they led him from the chamber, the Azuri noble, the disgraced inspector, the confessed murderer, the unlikely champion of justice, walked with his head held high. Because for the first time in his life, he had done something that mattered more than his own survival. The council session dissolved into pandemonium. Delegates from implicated houses tried to leave, only to find exit routes blocked by media representatives demanding statements. Officials whose names appeared in Veyrath's evidence frantically contacted lawyers. Corporate executives watched their stock values plummet as the scandal went viral across 300 worlds. And in human settlements across Alliance space, millions watched the broadcast with tears streaming down their faces. Someone had cared. Someone had sacrificed everything to give 7 forgotten humans the justice they deserved. Maya found Administrator Chen in the corridor outside the chamber. The human representative was shaking, her professional composure finally cracking. He destroyed himself, Maya said quietly. He confessed to everything. Why? Because, Administrator Chen said, wiping tears from her eyes. He looked at the evidence and saw people instead of things. And once you see people, you can't unsee them. You can't look away. You can't accept that their deaths don't matter. Do you think it will actually change anything? Or will the powerful just weather the scandal and continue as before? Administrator Chen looked at the chaos in the chamber. Delegates fleeing, media swarming, the carefully maintained facade of Alliance justice crumbling in real time. I don't know, she admitted, but for the first time since I entered politics, I have hope. Because if an Azuri noble can transform from perpetrator to confessor, if he can choose justice over self-preservation, then maybe, just maybe, this galaxy can change. In the holding cell where security had taken him, Veyrath sat alone and thought about Marcus Chen's final message, about a father's desperate hope that someone would remember his family. They would be remembered now. Their names would be spoken across Alliance space. Their story would force conversations the powerful had avoided for decades. It had cost Veyrath everything: his position, his house, his freedom, possibly his life, depending on how vindictive his enemies chose to be. But as he sat in the darkness, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. He had been a monster. He had done monstrous things. But in the end, he had chosen to be something better. The galaxy would judge him. History would judge him. And he deserved whatever judgment came. But 7 humans had finally received the justice they'd been denied, and perhaps that was enough. Outside the holding facility, protests erupted across the capital world. Humans and their allies demanding accountability, demanding reforms, demanding that provisional sentient classifications be abolished, that trafficking loopholes be closed, that the victims of decades of systematic exploitation finally receive recognition. The powerful would resist. Change would be slow and painful and incomplete, but it had begun, and nothing, not corruption, not political pressure, not fear of consequences, could stop it now. Because the galaxy had seen 7 humans die alone and forgotten, and the galaxy had seen one being, flawed, guilty, broken, choose to care anyway. In the end, that was what mattered. Not perfection, not innocence, not power, just the simple, radical choice to see suffering and refuse to look away. The confession had been delivered, the evidence released, the reckoning begun, and somewhere in the cold depths of space, Marcus Chen's message continued its eternal broadcast, no longer crying out to an indifferent universe. Finally, impossibly, it had been heard. Alliance Central Hub. 3 months after the confession, the tribunal chamber was designed for spectacle. Rising tiers of seating surrounded a central floor where the accused would stand, exposed to the judgment of hundreds. Holographic displays covered every wall, ensuring that even those in the highest seats could see the faces of those being prosecuted. And beyond the physical chamber, billions watched through broadcast feeds as the Alliance conducted what many were calling the trial of the century. 37 defendants sat in the accused section, their wrists bound with judicial restraints that glowed faintly with suppression fields. Corporate executives, government officials, noble house representatives, security coordinators, and at the center of them all, wearing the plain grey uniform that had become his only identity, Lord Veyrath Casisindri. Maya Rodriguez occupied her position in the media gallery, surrounded by journalists from 300 worlds. The past 3 months had been a whirlwind of investigation, revelation, and political earthquake. Veyrath's confession had opened floodgates that no one could close. Additional victims had been identified. 17 other humans who disappeared under similar circumstances over the past decade, 12 members of other provisional species, the insectoid scree, the aquatic drenai, the silicon-based korath, all of them taken, trafficked, used and discarded by networks that had operated with impunity because the victims lacked the power to demand justice. Until now. The chief arbiter, a neutral luminar selected by lottery from a pool of jurists, called the tribunal to order. Their containment suit gleamed under the chamber lights as they spoke. This tribunal convenes to adjudicate crimes of trafficking, murder, corruption, and conspiracy. The accused have been provided legal representation and will receive fair trial under Alliance law. Fair trial, someone in the gallery muttered bitterly. Several other journalists nodded. The cynic in Maya agreed. The truly powerful rarely faced real consequences, but the investigator in her had seen the evidence, had documented every connection, had watched the public outcry grow too large to silence. This time might actually be different. The prosecution began with the trafficking network itself. They presented evidence of the shell companies, the bribed officials, the systematic targeting of vulnerable individuals from provisional species. They showed financial records tracing payments from noble houses and corporations to operatives who specialized in discrete acquisitions. And they played Marcus Chen's recording again, forcing the entire galaxy to witness his final testimony. The defendant's lawyers argued jurisdiction, procedure, technicality. They claimed their clients had simply conducted business within the legal frameworks available. That provisional sentient classification made certain commercial arrangements permissible, that no one had explicitly violated Alliance law as written. As written, Administrator Chen said when she took the stand as a witness, those words condemn this entire proceeding because the law was deliberately written to permit these atrocities. Loopholes were maintained to facilitate exploitation, and when victims complained, they were dismissed as emotional, as exaggerating, as failing to understand the complexity of galactic commerce. The lead defense attorney, a sharp-eyed Vraask named Counselor Thex, clicked his mandibles dismissively. Administrator Chen, isn't it true that your species has benefited tremendously from Alliance membership? Access to trade routes, technology transfers, interstellar travel capabilities you could never have developed independently? It's true we've benefited from trade and technology, Administrator Chen said evenly. It's also true that those benefits came with the understanding that we would be treated as sentient beings with rights, not as livestock that could be bought and sold if the paperwork was filed correctly. But your species accepted provisional classification. You agreed to those terms when humanity petitioned for Alliance membership. We accepted them because the alternative was complete isolation, because we were told that provisional status was temporary, a pathway to full membership. We were not told it would be used as justification for our people to be trafficked and murdered. Counselor Thex's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. Surely you're not suggesting that the Alliance deliberately misrepresented the classification system? I'm stating a fact, Administrator Chen said, her voice hardening. 60 years of provisional status, 5 applications for full membership, all denied. And during those 60 years, at least 29 humans that we know of have been trafficked using legal loopholes that this council has refused to close despite repeated petitions. So yes, Counselor Thex, I am absolutely suggesting that the system was designed to keep certain species vulnerable. The chamber erupted in murmurs. The chief arbiter called for order. The trial continued for weeks, witness after witness, evidence piling higher and higher, the way station Gamma 7 recordings, financial records, testimonies from survivors of other trafficking operations who'd been rescued once the investigation expanded, And then came the moment Maya had been waiting for, the moment when Veyrath himself would testify. The former inspector rose from his seat, his movements careful despite the suppression restraints. He'd lost weight during his imprisonment. His skin had dulled from silver gold to a flat grey that suggested profound stress. But his eyes remained clear, focused, unafraid. The chief arbiter addressed him formally. "Lord Veyrath Khasisindri, you stand accused of conspiracy to commit trafficking, accessory to murder, corruption, and abuse of office. You have confessed to these crimes. Do you maintain that confession?" "I do," Veyrath said. "Then explain to this tribunal why you participated in these crimes. What motivated an Ajuri noble of high station to facilitate the abduction and trafficking of 7 humans?" Veyrath was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, and his words carried across the chamber with devastating honesty. "Greed motivated me. Indifference. The casual certainty that some lives matter less than others. I was raised in a culture that taught me species like humans were provisional not just in their alliance status, but in their basic right to exist. We called them weak, short-lived, primitive. We dismissed their protests as emotional overreaction. We told ourselves that if they couldn't defend themselves, they deserved whatever happened to them." He paused, scanning the defendants beside him. Several refused to meet his eyes. "I watched the human troupe perform at the Alliance feast. I saw a father desperately trying to provide for his children. I saw a grandmother playing ancient instruments with arthritic hands. I saw children performing with hope in their eyes, despite knowing the galaxy viewed them as inferior. And I felt nothing except opportunity." His voice grew quieter, but no less intense. "I made a call. I facilitated their abduction. I received payment. And I felt no shame because I genuinely believed that humans were things, not people, that their suffering was unfortunate but ultimately unimportant, that my wealth and status justified any means of acquisition." "When did that belief change?" the chief arbiter asked. "When I saw the evidence, when I watched Marcus Chen's recording, when I had to look at what had been done to those 7 people and acknowledge that they were people, not provisional sentience, not acceptable collateral. People who loved and hoped and suffered exactly as any Ajuri would. People whose lives had value regardless of their military strength or biological advantages or economic power." Veyrath turned to face the gallery, facing the cameras, facing the billions watching across Alliance space. "I cannot undo what I did. I cannot restore those lives. But I can acknowledge the truth that our civilization has spent centuries denying. Power does not grant righteousness. Strength does not confer worth. And every sentient being, regardless of their species or status or abilities, deserves dignity." The silence in the chamber was absolute. "I am guilty," Veyrath said simply. "I deserve punishment, but I am not the only one guilty in this room. The systems that facilitated these crimes, the classification structures, the legal loopholes, the cultural assumptions that some lives matter less, those systems implicate all of us. Every species that benefited from provisional classifications, every government that refused to close trafficking loopholes, every individual who heard humans complain about injustice and dismissed them as overreacting." He gestured to the other defendants. "These people broke laws, but they broke laws that were written to be broken. They exploited systems that were designed to be exploited. And if we punish them without changing those systems, we will simply be performing justice rather than actually achieving it." Councillor Thex rose to cross-examine. "Lord Veyrath, isn't it convenient that you've discovered this moral awakening only after being caught? That you're now positioning yourself as a reformer despite being a perpetrator?" "It's not convenient at all," Veyrath said. "It's devastatingly inconvenient. My confession has destroyed my house, endangered my offspring, and guaranteed my imprisonment. I am not a reformer. I am a criminal who, too late, recognized the humanity in his victims." "Humanity?" Councillor Thex clicked derisively. "An interesting word choice. Are you suggesting that only human suffering matters?" "I'm suggesting that the word humanity should apply to all sentient beings, that compassion, dignity, and worth are not species-specific, that what was done to Marcus Chen and his family could be done to any of us if we lack sufficient power to prevent it." The cross-examination continued for hours, but Veyrath never wavered. He acknowledged every crime, accepted full responsibility, and consistently redirected attention to the systemic issues that had made those crimes possible. Maya watched from the gallery and realized she was witnessing something extraordinary, not redemption. Veyrath's crimes were too severe for that simple narrative. But transformation, a person confronting their worst self and choosing, despite every incentive not to become something different. The trial lasted 6 weeks total. The evidence was overwhelming. The confessions detailed. The testimonies devastating. When the verdicts came, they shocked no one. Guilty. All 37 defendants. Trafficking, murder, corruption, conspiracy. The sentences varied. Corporate executives received substantial prison terms and complete asset forfeiture. Government officials lost their positions and faced imprisonment ranging from 10 to 40 years. Members of noble houses had their titles stripped, their families disgraced, their wealth seized to compensate victims' families. And Veyrath received the harshest sentence of all, 75 years imprisonment in a maximum security facility with no possibility of early release. His house was dissolved, his name stricken from jury records, his offspring forced to choose new family names to escape the stigma. But before the defendants were removed from the chamber, the chief arbiter made one additional statement. This tribunal acknowledges that Lord Veyrath's confession and cooperation were essential to achieving these convictions. Without his testimony and evidence, the vast majority of these defendants would never have been identified or prosecuted. While this does not excuse his crimes, it demonstrates a capacity for conscience that suggests reform may be possible. The arbiter paused, their containment suit flickering with what might have been emotion. Therefore, this tribunal recommends that Lord Veyrath be transferred after 10 years to a rehabilitation facility where he may contribute to anti-trafficking education and victim advocacy, not as penance but as restitution, using his knowledge and experience to prevent future crimes. In the gallery, Administrator Chen closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. Not justice, exactly. Not forgiveness, but something more complex. An acknowledgement that people could change, that guilt and redemption could coexist, that punishment should include the possibility of transformation. As security led the defendants away, Veyrath paused and looked up at the gallery. His eyes found Maya's camera, and through it he addressed everyone watching. "Remember the Chen family," he said. "Remember their names. Remember that they mattered. And remember that every being in this galaxy deserves the dignity they were denied. Don't let their deaths be forgotten. Don't let the systems that killed them continue unchanged. Be better than I was. Be better than we have been." Then he was gone, led away to begin a sentence that would consume the rest of his life. But his words remained, echoing through the chamber, broadcast across Alliance space, forcing conversations that could no longer be avoided. In human settlements across 300 worlds, families watched the verdicts with mixed emotions. Relief that justice had been achieved, anger that it had taken so long, grief that it required such tragedy to force change, and determination to ensure it meant something. The trial ended, but the transformation had just begun. The Alliance Council, pressured by protests and public outcry, and the undeniable evidence of systematic exploitation, voted to eliminate provisional sentient classifications entirely. All species would be granted full membership or denied membership completely. No more legal limbo, no more loopholes. The vote passed by the narrowest margin imaginable, but it passed. Administrator Chen stood in the council chamber as the results were announced and allowed herself, for just a moment, to weep. 70 years of advocacy, 60 years of being told humanity needed to be patient, needed to accept their place, needed to prove themselves worthy. And finally, because 7 people died and 1 guilty man chose truth over survival, everything changed. The reforms were incomplete, the investigations ongoing, the cultural transformation would take generations, but it had begun. And in the memorial on Terra Minor, which had become a permanent shrine, someone added a new plaque beneath the pictures of the 7 victims. It read simply, "They were people, they mattered, we will not forget." Maya stood before that plaque and recorded her final documentary segment. The human troupe vanished 6 years ago at the Alliance feast. They died alone and forgotten in a way station's darkness. But their deaths sparked a reckoning that changed the galaxy. Not because they were special, but because they were ordinary people who deserved dignity, and one guilty soul decided they were worth destroying himself to acknowledge that truth. She looked directly into the camera. "This is Maya Rodriguez, reporting from Terra Minor. Remember their names: Marcus Chen, Elena Chen, Lily Chen, David Chen, Jamie Torres, Cora Osei, Thomas Wei. They performed for a galaxy that dismissed them. They died because that galaxy deemed them disposable. And they transformed everything because someone finally, impossibly chose to care. The documentary ended, the camera powered down, and Maya walked through the memorial, reading messages left by thousands of humans who finally, after generations of indignity, believed their lives might actually matter to someone beyond themselves. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to balance the scales, but it was something, and sometimes something was all you could hope for. The galaxy had been forced to look at its darkest corners, and in those corners it had found not just horror, but also the possibility of change. 7 humans had died, and in dying, they had finally been seen. That was the tragedy, and the triumph, and the terrible, beautiful truth of it all. 10 years after the trial, rehabilitation facility, Epsilon 9, neutral space. The classroom was simple, 30 seats arranged in a semicircle facing a single podium. No restraints, no suppression fields, no visible security. Just students and a teacher whose past made him perhaps the most infamous educator in Alliance space. Veyrath stood at the podium, his appearance transformed by a decade of imprisonment and rehabilitation. His skin had regained some of its silver tone, though it would never achieve the golden sheen of his former nobility. His eyes remained clear, but lines of exhaustion and regret had carved themselves permanently into his features. He wore the plain grey uniform of the facility, neither prisoner nor free citizen, but something in between. The students were young, diplomats in training, law enforcement cadets, civil rights advocates, students from 100 species learning about trafficking prevention and victims' rights. They came from every corner of Alliance space, drawn by the opportunity to learn from someone who understood the mechanisms of exploitation from the inside, from someone who had been a monster and chosen, painfully, to become a teacher instead. Today we're discussing systemic enablement, Veyrath began, his voice carrying the authority of terrible experience. Not the dramatic crimes, those are easy to condemn. We're talking about the 1,000 small choices that make atrocities possible. The bureaucrat who doesn't quite investigate a suspicious contract, the diplomat who looks away from uncomfortable truths, the citizen who hears about injustice and decides it's not their problem. A young human in the front row, a law enforcement cadet named Sarah Martinez, raised her hand. How do we prevent those small choices? How do we build systems that make it harder to look away? Veyrath smiled slightly. It was a question he'd been asked 1,000 times, and one he still struggled to answer completely. By making the cost of complicity higher than the cost of action, by creating transparency, by elevating voices that power traditionally silences, and by remembering that every victim has a name, a story, a family that loved them. He pulled up a holographic display. 7 faces appeared, familiar to everyone in the room. The Chen family. Their images had become iconic, reproduced in memorials and educational materials across Alliance space. Marcus Chen, Veyrath said, and his voice carried the weight of personal guilt that 10 years had not diminished. He was an electrical engineer before the factory closed. He learned to perform because it was the only way to feed his children. He organized benefit concerts for neighbors who couldn't afford medical care. He died begging for someone to remember his family was human. Sarah's hand rose again. Do you think about them? The people you helped kill? It was a bold question, impertinent even. But Veyrath had insisted his students ask difficult questions, refuse comfortable narratives, push past the sanitized versions of history. Every day, he said quietly, I think about Lily Chen needing medication her family couldn't afford. I think about David Chen practicing drums on salvaged materials. I think about Elena Chen fighting guards 3 times her size to protect her grandchildren. I think about Marcus recording his final message, hoping against hope that someone would care. He paused, meeting Sarah's eyes. I think about standing in my private box at the Alliance feast, watching them perform, seeing their exhaustion and hope and desperate pride. And I think about making a call that condemned them to death because I genuinely believed their lives were worth less than 85,000 credits. The classroom was silent. This was why students came to learn from Veyrath, not despite his crimes, but because of them. Because he refused to minimize or rationalize or hide behind comfortable distance. He taught from the perspective of perpetrator, forcing his students to understand how ordinary people, educated, civilized, respectable people, could commit atrocities. The hardest lesson I can teach you, Veyrath continued, is that I am not special. I'm not uniquely evil. I was a product of systems that taught me some lives matter more than others. Systems that rewarded exploitation and punished empathy. Systems that allowed me to see humans as things rather than people. A Vraask student named Thikakra clicked their mandibles thoughtfully. But you changed. You confessed. You destroyed yourself to seek justice. Doesn't that suggest you were fundamentally different from others in your position? No, Veyrath said firmly. It suggests I was confronted with evidence I couldn't ignore and made a choice. Others in my position could make the same choice. They simply haven't been forced to yet. And that's the work you'll do. Forcing confrontation, making complicity visible, removing the comfortable distance that lets people ignore suffering. The lesson continued for 2 hours. Veyrath walked his students through the mechanisms of trafficking, the legal loopholes, the financial structures, the cultural assumptions. He showed them how to identify victims, how to investigate networks, how to dismantle the systems that facilitated exploitation. And he did it all from the perspective of someone who had used those systems, who understood them intimately, who could teach the next generation exactly how they worked so they could be prevented. When class ended, Sarah approached the podium. "Professor Veyrath," she said, using the courtesy title the facility had granted him. "I'm writing my thesis on rehabilitation of high-level offenders. Can I interview you?" "Of course," Veyrath said. "But I should tell you I don't consider myself rehabilitated. I consider myself accountable. There's a difference." "Explain?" Veyrath gathered his teaching materials, his movements careful and practiced. "Rehabilitation suggests I've been restored to some previous good state, but I was never good. I was privileged and cruel and indifferent. What I am now is someone who has acknowledged his crimes and chosen to spend his remaining life trying to prevent others from making the same choices. Not redemption, just restitution." Sarah made notes on her datapad. "You've taught at this facility for 5 years now. You've trained thousands of students. You've contributed to major reforms in trafficking prevention. Doesn't that count for something?" "It counts for the students I teach and the victims they might save. It doesn't erase the 7 people I helped kill." Veyrath met her eyes. "Don't make me into a redemption story, Cadet Martinez. I'm a cautionary tale. I'm what happens when intelligence and privilege combine with indifference. I'm useful as a teacher, precisely because I remain guilty." They walked together through the facility's corridors, past classrooms and offices and common areas where students from 300 worlds studied the prevention of atrocities. The facility itself was a product of the reforms that followed the trial, a place where perpetrators who demonstrated genuine transformation could contribute to education and advocacy. Not everyone supported the concept. Many victims' families protested that criminals were being allowed to rehabilitate their reputations. Maya Rodriguez had written extensively about the ethical complications. Even Administrator Chen had expressed reservations. But the program continued because the results were undeniable. Students trained by former perpetrators understood the mechanisms of exploitation in ways that theoretical educators never could. They learned to think like traffickers, to anticipate loopholes, to recognize warning signs. They became more effective because they learned from someone who had been the enemy. Sarah stopped at a window overlooking the facility's memorial garden. 7 trees had been planted there, each one representing a member of the human troupe. Beneath each tree was a plaque with a name and brief biography. Students visited the garden before each class, a requirement that Veyrath himself had insisted upon. "Why do you make students visit the memorial?" Sarah asked. "Because it's easy to talk about trafficking prevention in abstract terms, statistics, legal frameworks, enforcement mechanisms. It's much harder when you're standing beneath a tree planted for a 7-year-old girl who died of exposure because she was considered disposable." Veyrath's voice roughened. "I make them visit because I need them to understand that every case they work will involve real people, people with names and families and dreams, people who deserve more than being forgotten." They reached Veyrath's office, a small space lined with shelves of datapads and investigative materials. On one wall hung a printed image of Marcus Chen from the holographic recording, gaunt, desperate, determined to be remembered. Sarah noticed it immediately. "You keep his picture in your office." "I keep all 7 of their pictures, visible from my desk, so that every day when I prepare lessons or review cases or meet with students, I see the consequences of my choices." Veyrath sat heavily in his chair. "Some people think that's performative guilt, self-flagellation. But it's not about my feelings. It's about maintaining clarity, about never letting myself forget what happens when we decide some lives matter less than others. Sarah sat across from him, her datapad ready. For my thesis, walk me through the transformation. What specifically changed your mind? Veyrath considered the question carefully. He'd answered it hundreds of times, but he tried to approach it freshly each time, to avoid the trap of rehearsed responses that lost their truth. It wasn't a single moment, he said finally. It was accumulation. Watching Marcus's recording again and again while building my investigation, seeing the memorial on Terra Minor grow to fill 2 city blocks, reading testimonials from neighbors describing the Chen family's kindness, learning that Marcus had organized benefit concerts for people who couldn't afford medical care, while I'd received 85,000 credits for facilitating his abduction. He pulled up files on his desk console, images from the investigation. But the real transformation came when I looked at my own offspring. I have 3 children, Cadet Martinez. I love them with a fierceness that transcends species, and I realized that Marcus Chen loved his children exactly the same way, that Elena Chen had protected her grandchildren with the same desperation I would feel protecting mine. That every parent in the galaxy, regardless of species, experiences that fundamental terror of losing their children. So empathy changed you. Recognition changed me. Empathy was always possible. I simply chose not to exercise it, because doing so would have complicated my comfortable life. But once I truly recognized humans as people, once I acknowledged that Marcus Chen's love for his daughter was identical to my love for mine, I couldn't maintain the fiction anymore. Sarah made rapid notes. And the confession. That was essentially suicide. You destroyed your house, endangered your family, guaranteed your imprisonment. Why not just quietly resign and disappear? Because Marcus asked someone to remember, to care, to acknowledge that his family had mattered. Veyrath's multifaceted eyes caught the light from his desk lamp. I couldn't give him his life back, couldn't restore his children, couldn't undo anything I'd done. But I could give him what he'd begged for. Someone caring enough to seek real justice instead of convenient theater. Some people say your confession was about your guilt, not the victims. They're probably right, Veyrath admitted. I'm not a selfless person. I confessed because carrying the secret was destroying me, because I couldn't look at my own children without seeing Lily and David Chen, because living with what I'd done had become unbearable. So yes, my confession was at least partially about my own psychological survival. He leaned forward. But does that make the results less valuable? 37 convictions, complete dismantling of trafficking networks, elimination of provisional sentient classifications, reforms that have protected thousands of beings from the fate the Chen family suffered. If my motives were impure, but the outcomes were good, does the impurity negate the good? Sarah smiled slightly. That's a question philosophers have been arguing about for millennia, and I'm not qualified to answer it. I'm a criminal teaching other people not to become criminals. I'm a cautionary tale that happened to produce some useful results. Don't make me more than that. The interview continued for another hour. Sarah asked about the trial, the public response, the hate mail Veyrath received from those who thought his sentence too lenient. She asked about his relationship with his offspring, who had legally disowned him to escape his stigma, but still visited twice a year in secret. She asked about his plans for the future, and Veyrath laughed bitterly. I have 65 years remaining on my sentence. I'll spend them teaching students like you. I'll spend them contributing to trafficking prevention. I'll spend them trying to save people I'll never meet from fates I helped create. He gestured to the 7 pictures on his wall. I'll spend them accountable to those faces. That's not a future. It's a sentence I've accepted. Nothing more. When Sarah left, Veyrath sat alone in his office and pulled up files he kept encrypted and hidden from all but his most trusted colleagues. Information about other cases, other disappearances, other victims who'd been forgotten because they lacked the power to demand remembrance. He'd been working quietly with Administrator Chen and Maya Rodriguez, using his knowledge of trafficking networks to identify additional victims. So far, they'd found 43 more individuals who'd vanished under suspicious circumstances. Some were human, others were Scree, Draenei, Korath, species that had been granted full alliance membership but remained vulnerable because of economic marginalization. Each case was documented, each name recorded, each family contacted, if any survived. It was slow work, painful work, work that wouldn't undo his crimes but might prevent future ones. As the facility's lights dimmed for the evening cycle, Veyrath remained at his desk, reviewing case files, preparing tomorrow's lesson, maintaining the endless vigil he'd chosen for himself. On his wall, Marcus Chen's image stared down at him, desperate, gaunt, unbroken. "I remember," Veyrath said quietly to the empty office. "I remember all of you, and I'm teaching others to remember. It's not enough, it will never be enough, but it's what I have." Outside, in the memorial garden, the 7 trees swayed in the artificial breeze, their leaves rustling like whispered names. Marcus, Elena, Lily, David, Jamie, Cora, Thomas. The forgotten, finally remembered. The dismissed, finally acknowledged. The dead, transformed into a legacy that might save the living. It was a terrible price for change. But then again, change had always been expensive. And some debts could never be fully paid, only acknowledged in perpetuity. Veyrath turned off his office lights and walked to his living quarters, where he would sleep restlessly and dream of faces he could never forget. Tomorrow he would teach again, and the day after, and the day after that. For the rest of his life he would teach, and remember, and carry the weight of names that had become his purpose. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. And in a galaxy that had almost forgotten 7 humans entirely, something was infinitely better than nothing. 20 years after the discovery. Terra Minor, Memorial Plaza. The plaza had been transformed. What had begun as a spontaneous memorial on a single street corner had grown into a permanent monument, occupying 3 city blocks. 7 statues stood at its center, cast in durable alloy that caught the light of Terra Minor's sun and glowed softly in the evening darkness. Marcus Chen stood with his arms outstretched, forever frozen in the moment of lifting his daughter for an aerial performance. Lily, captured mid-flight, her face tilted upward toward stars she would never reach. Elena with her accordion, her expression fierce and protective. David at his drums, young and hopeful. Jamie and Cora suspended in impossible acrobatic poses. Thomas with his violin, playing music that only memory could hear. Around the statues, the plaza had become a living memorial. Gardens bloomed year-round, tended by volunteers who'd never met the Chen family, but had been transformed by their story. Educational displays explained the trafficking networks that had been dismantled in the wake of their deaths. Holographic projections showed excerpts from Marcus's final recording, playing on an endless loop so that no visitor could ignore his testimony. And today, on the 20th anniversary of the Waystation discovery, thousands had gathered for the annual remembrance performance. Maya Rodriguez stood at the edge of the crowd, her hair now streaked with gray, her face lined by 2 decades of relentless journalism. She'd won every major award her profession offered for her coverage of the case. She'd written 3 books documenting the investigation, the trial, and the subsequent reforms. She'd become the voice humanity trusted to tell their stories with honesty and dignity. But today she was just a witness, recording not for broadcast, but for personal archive, preserving this moment for herself, for history, for the future that 7 people hadn't lived to see. The performance began at sunset, as it always did. The current human troupe of Terra Minor, 12 performers ranging from children to elders, took the stage that had been erected in the plaza's center. They wore costumes that echoed the original troupe's faded red performance clothes, a deliberate homage to the family that had inspired them. The music started, not Clair de Lune this time, but something new, a composition written specifically for this anniversary, combining human melodies with alien instrumentation, a symphony of species working together to create beauty that transcended any single culture. The dancers moved with grace and power, telling a story through movement, the story of a family stolen and forgotten, of a galaxy that had looked away until it couldn't anymore, of transformation born from tragedy, of justice pursued despite impossible odds, of voices that refused to be silenced, even in death. Maya watched through tears as the young girl playing Lily executed the same aerial sequence Marcus had performed with his daughter 20 years ago. The crowd gasped at the beauty of it, at the poignant echo of that final public performance before everything ended. But this time, the performance didn't end in darkness. This time, as the music swelled and the dancers formed their final tableau, something extraordinary happened. Holographic projections activated throughout the plaza, and suddenly the air filled with faces, hundreds of them, thousands. Every victim of trafficking who'd been identified in the 20 years since the Chen family's discovery, every person whose name had been recovered from the darkness, every being who'd been forgotten until someone chose to remember. Humans, Scree, Draenei, Korath, Vrask, who'd been taken from rival clans, Luminar, who'd been captured during diplomatic missions, even a few Azuri who'd fallen from power and discovered that nobility offered no protection when you lacked allies. All of them projected in light, their faces surrounding the performance, bearing witness. "We remember," the crowd whispered, the words spreading through thousands of voices. "We remember, we remember." Administrator Chen stood on the official platform, older now but still unbowed. She'd served humanity for 40 years total, fighting battles large and small, winning some and losing others, but never surrendering the fundamental belief that her people deserved dignity. When the performance concluded and the dancers took their bows, she approached the microphone. Her voice, amplified across the plaza and broadcast to alliance networks, carried the weight of everything that had been lost and won. 20 years ago, the galaxy learned that 7 humans had been murdered. Stolen during a performance meant to showcase our culture. Killed because we were considered disposable. And for a moment, a brief, shining moment, the galaxy cared. She paused, letting the words settle. "Today I stand before you not to mourn, though we do mourn, but to celebrate what their deaths created. Full alliance membership for humanity, finally granted after 70 years of provisional status. Complete elimination of trafficking loopholes that claimed thousands of lives. Rehabilitation programs that transform perpetrators into educators. Legal frameworks that protect the vulnerable across 300 worlds." Administrator Chen's voice strengthened. The Chen family didn't choose to be martyrs. They wanted to live, to perform, to raise their children in peace. They wanted what every being wants: simple dignity and the right to exist without fear. They didn't want to change the galaxy. They just wanted to survive in it. She gestured to the 7 statues. But because they died, and because one guilty soul decided they were worth confessing for, and because 2 smugglers chose documentation over profit, and because a journalist refused to let their story be buried, and because communities like this one demanded justice, everything changed. Not perfectly, not completely. The reforms are still incomplete. The cultural transformation is still ongoing. There are still beings trafficked, still lives considered disposable, still systems that value power over compassion. But it's better than it was. And it's better because 7 ordinary people were remembered. The crowd was silent now, hanging on every word. "So today we remember Marcus Chen, who loved his children enough to record a message begging the galaxy to care. We remember Eleanor Chen, who fought impossible odds to protect her grandchildren. We remember Lily and David, who never got to grow up and discover what they might have become. We remember Jamie, Cora, and Thomas, who died far from home in darkness and cold." Administrator Chen's voice cracked, but she pushed through. "And we remember that their lives mattered, not because they were special, not because they were heroes, but because they were people. And being people should be enough." She raised her hand in the traditional human gesture of farewell, and the crowd responded, thousands of hands lifting toward the statues, toward the holographic faces floating in the evening air, toward the memory of all who'd been lost. "We remember," the crowd said again, and this time it was a promise, a commitment, a refusal to let the forgotten remain forgotten. The ceremony continued for hours. Speakers from dozens of species shared testimonies. Survivors of trafficking told their stories. Students from Veyrath's rehabilitation program presented research on prevention methods. Children placed flowers at the base of each statue, while their parents explained why remembrance mattered. And as the twin moons rose over Terra Minor, as the plaza lights illuminated the 7 statues in soft gold, Maya found herself approached by a young woman she didn't immediately recognize. "Ms. Rodriguez, I'm Anna Chen. Marcus was my cousin." Maya's breath caught. She'd interviewed extended family members during her initial investigation, but most had been too destroyed by grief to maintain contact. "Anna, I didn't know you were coming. I live off-world now, on Earth actually, but I come back every year for this." Anna gazed at the statues, her expression a complex mixture of grief and pride. "I wanted to thank you for making sure they weren't forgotten, for fighting to tell their story when everyone else wanted it buried." "I just documented the truth," Maya said quietly. "You did more than that. You made the galaxy see them as people. You gave them back their humanity when even death tried to take it away." Anna pulled out a small data chip. "I brought something. Family recordings from before. Marcus and the kids performing at my wedding. Elena teaching Lily to play accordion. Just normal family moments. I thought maybe they could be added to the memorial archives. Maya took the chip carefully, as if it were precious beyond measure, which it was. I'll make sure they're preserved and shared if you're comfortable with that. Please do. Let people see them happy. Let people know they were more than victims. They were talented and kind and funny and real. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as the plaza slowly emptied, as volunteers began the gentle work of preparing for tomorrow's visitors, as the eternal holographic projections continued their vigil of faces. Do you think it made a difference? Anna asked suddenly. All of this, the trials, the reforms, the memorials, do you think the galaxy actually changed, or did we just get better at performing concern? It was the question Maya had been asking herself for 20 years. The question that kept her working, investigating, documenting, refusing to let comfortable narratives replace uncomfortable truths. Both, she said finally. The galaxy changed in real measurable ways. Trafficking is genuinely harder now. Vulnerable species have better protections. The cultural assumption that some lives matter less has been challenged, though not eliminated. But change is fragile. Reforms can be reversed. Attention fades. New generations forget why the rules exist and chafe at restrictions. The work of maintaining justice is never finished. It requires constant vigilance, constant advocacy, constant willingness to fight battles that should have been won permanently but never quite are. Maya turned to face Anna directly. Your cousin's deaths sparked transformation, but the transformation only continues because people choose to continue it. Every teacher who uses their story in lessons, every law enforcement officer who investigates trafficking complaints seriously, every journalist who reports on exploitation despite powerful interests wanting silence, every ordinary citizen who refuses to look away from suffering. So the performance continues, Anna said softly. The performance continues, Maya agreed. That's what Marcus and Elena would want. Not for their family to be frozen as victims, but for their story to inspire ongoing work. They performed for a living, made beauty and meaning, despite poverty and prejudice, made people feel things. And now they're still performing, still making people feel, still creating meaning from tragedy. They were interrupted by a commotion at the plaza entrance, security officers surrounding someone, media representatives clamoring for attention. Maya recognized the figure at the center immediately, though she hadn't seen him in person for years. Veyrath, accompanied by facility supervisors, permitted to attend the memorial for the first time since his conviction. He looked ancient now. Ajuri aged differently than humans, but 20 years of imprisonment and education work had taken their toll. His skin was dull silver, his movements careful and pained, but his eyes remained clear, focused, determined. Maya watched as he approached the statues, as the crowd parted uncertainly around him. Some people protested his presence, others simply stared. The man who'd facilitated the murders, the man who'd confessed and transformed the galaxy, the perpetrator-educator, whose story was as complicated as the reforms he'd helped create. Veyrath stood before Marcus's statue for a long time, his head bowed. Then he placed 7 items at the statue's base, small wooden carvings, clearly handmade, each one shaped like a musical instrument or performance tool: accordion, violin, drums, props representing each member of the troupe. I made these, he said, his voice barely carrying past the immediate crowd, in my cell, over years. It's inadequate. Everything I do is inadequate, but I needed to contribute something to acknowledge that I'm here because of them, that everything I've become since the confession exists because they died, and I couldn't look away from what that meant. Administrator Chen approached, her expression unreadable. She and Veyrath had worked together extensively over the past 2 decades, an unlikely partnership born of necessity and shared purpose. But standing here before the statues of the people he'd helped kill, the complexity of that relationship became almost unbearable. Why did you come? She asked simply. Because I need to remember, Veyrath said. I teach remembrance. I require my students to visit memorials, to learn names, to understand that every case involves real people. And I needed to do the same, to stand here where the galaxy remembers them, to acknowledge publicly what I acknowledge privately every day. Some people think you shouldn't be here, that your presence desecrates the memorial. They're probably right, Veyrath agreed. I am desecration. I am what happens when intelligence and privilege combine with indifference. I'm here anyway because Marcus Chen asked to be remembered, and part of that remembrance is acknowledging who forgot him, who dismissed him, who condemned him. He looked at the statues, at the 7 faces frozen in performance. I don't ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I needed to be here, to see what my choices created, to stand accountable not just in a classroom, but in the place where their memory lives. Administrator Chen was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised everyone listening, including herself. You're right. You are desecration. You're also transformation. You're both things simultaneously, and we have to hold both truths at once. You helped kill them. You also helped avenge them. Those facts coexist, uncomfortable and unresolved. She gestured to the statues, to the plaza, to the thousands who'd gathered. This memorial exists because of them and because of you. Their deaths and your confession, their humanity and your inhumanity transformed into something that saves lives. It's messy, it's complicated, it's uncomfortable, and it's real. Thank you, Veyrath said quietly, for not simplifying it, for holding the complexity. Don't thank me. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because the Chen family deserves complete truth, not comfortable narratives. And the complete truth is that your guilt and your redemption, if we can even call it that, are both part of their legacy. Veyrath nodded, understanding. He stood before the statues a few minutes longer, then turned to leave, back to the facility where he would spend the rest of his life teaching, remembering, carrying names like sacred weights. As he passed Maya, he paused. Your documentaries have been more important than any sentence the courts could impose. You made them real, made them matter. Thank you for that. I didn't do it for you, Maya said flatly. I know. You did it for them. As you should. As everyone should. And then he was gone, escorted back to his limited freedom, his perpetual accountability. The plaza slowly emptied as night deepened. Families with sleepy children, activists planning next year's memorial, students discussing what they'd learned, the normal ebb and flow of life continuing around the monument to lives that had ended too soon. Maya and Anna stayed until nearly midnight, sitting on a bench facing the statues, watching the holographic faces continue their eternal vigil. What will you do now? Anna asked. Keep working. There are other stories that need telling, other victims who need remembering. The Chen family opened doors, but there are still so many rooms full of forgotten people. Maya smiled tiredly. I'm too old for this work, but I'm not old enough to stop. And Veyrath? We'll keep teaching until he dies. We'll carry their names until his last breath. We'll live with the impossible contradiction of being both monster and educator, guilty and useful, condemned and necessary. Is that enough? Maya considered the question. The same question that had haunted her for 20 years. Was any of this enough? Could anything balance the scales when children died in darkness and cold? It has to be, she said finally, because it's what we have. 7 people died. We can't restore them, can't give them back their futures. But we can make sure they're remembered, make sure their deaths meant something, make sure the systems that killed them were challenged and changed. We can make sure the performance continues. Exactly. They sat in comfortable silence as the twin moons crossed the sky above Terra Minor. In the distance, ships came and went from the spaceport, carrying beings from 300 worlds. Some of them would visit this memorial tomorrow, would learn the story of the human Troupe, would carry that knowledge back to their homeworlds. The story would spread, the names would be spoken, the changes would continue, fragile and incomplete but real. And somewhere in the vast darkness of space, on an abandoned way station that had been converted into a memorial satellite, Marcus Chen's final recording still played on its eternal loop. Not because anyone needed to hear it anymore, the message had been received, the galaxy had finally listened, but because some things should never stop being said. My name is Marcus Chen. We are not animals. We are not objects. We are human, and we matter. 20 years later, the galaxy finally believed him. Not perfectly, not universally, but enough to change laws, enough to transform systems, enough to ensure that when the next family performed for an indifferent audience, someone would be watching with compassion instead of calculation. The performance continued, in memorial plazas and rehabilitation facilities, in courtrooms and classrooms, in the hearts of those who'd learned to see suffering and refused to look away. 7 people had performed. 7 people had died. 7 people had been forgotten and then remembered so completely that the galaxy itself transformed around their memory. It was a terrible price for change, but then again, change had always been expensive, and some performances once started never truly end. They echo through generations, through reforms, through the slow, painful work of becoming better than what came before. Marcus Chen had asked to be remembered. 20 years later, the galaxy was still learning what that meant, and would be, perhaps forever, learning still. The performance continues. The names persist. The change, hard-won and fragile, endures. Not because heroes demanded it, not because the powerful granted it, but because ordinary people, performers and smugglers, journalists and administrators, even monsters seeking redemption, chose to care when caring cost them everything. That was the real story, the true legacy. Not that 7 humans were special, but that they were ordinary. And that being ordinary was enough, should always have been enough, would, after 20 years of transformation, finally begin to be enough. The memorial lights dimmed for the night, but the holographic faces remained, always watching, always remembered, always performing their final act, refusing to be forgotten. And in the morning, when the plaza opened again, thousands would come, would see the statues, would learn the names, would carry the story forward into whatever future humanity and its allies could build together. The human troupe had vanished in 3003 at the Alliance Feast. 6 years later, they were found in a smuggling tunnel. And 20 years after that discovery, they remained the most powerful performers in the galaxy, not because of their skill, not because of their art, but because they'd transformed their deaths into a legacy that saved lives, changed systems, and reminded the galaxy of a simple truth it had spent centuries denying. Every being matters. Every life has value. Every voice deserves to be heard, even, especially the forgotten ones. The performance continues, and will continue, forever, perhaps, as long as there are people willing to remember, to fight, to refuse the comfortable fiction that some lives matter less than others. 7 faces in the darkness, 7 names spoken in memorial, 7 lives that changed everything. Marcus, Elena, Lily, David, Jamie, Cora, Thomas. Remember them, honor them, and in honoring them, honor every forgotten soul who deserves to be seen. That is their legacy. That is their triumph. That is the performance that never ends. The galaxy watched, and finally, impossibly, learned to care. The end.